So now the story of Libya. So I did this thing with my dad where he was a foreign service officer, right? And and he used to write these cables, and actually as a kid sometimes his non-secret cables I would proofread. So I got to learn like the cable format, and that was interesting, right? So and that was really when I learned that a U.S. embassy isn't there to relate as like a peer-to-peer basis with the country; it's there to supervise the country, right? Everybody should know that, but no one does. In any case, so my dad and I sat down and we read some cables from the U.S. embassy in Libya. Which had been leaked by WikiLeaks, right? He's retired. He couldn't even looked at these cables if it would have violated all kinds of security clearances. But now that he's retired, he can actually do that. And it's fascinating. I mean, anyone can go and read these Libya cables because basically what happens in Libya is that Gaddafi makes sort of the other decision than Saddam. He's like, okay, we're going to not be at war with the international community. We can't win this war. Like, you know what? And I'm going to basically, I'm like, they seem to be offering me this deal where I could be like a normal Arab despot. And like, I could be like, why I could call myself Sheikh. I could be the Sheikh of Libya. I could be the king. I'll be the emperor of Libya, right? But somehow there's this huge difference where the rulers with the traditional titles can hang on, but the ones without it can't. Except in Algeria, I guess. But in any case, and Algeria is still in question, actually, unfortunately. So in any case, Gaddafi is being offered this deal, and this is a deal that many people in Washington have worked hard on. Like, they believe in this, and it even has a name. I think they use the same term both for reopening relations with Libya and with Iran. They call it the grand opening, right? So this was the grand opening to Libya. And you'll notice that, there was never like a grand opening to South Africa. It's actually, these revolutions still have their leftist revolutionary credentials. As you may know, the State Department was very active in pushing the Shah out, and supporting these despots means not overthrowing them, right? So Gaddafi is like, okay, first of all, 9/11 happened. The U.S. is really pissed, and they're basically going around, countries they don't like and throwing them against the wall. And they did it. Right? They
succeeded in Iraq.
Yeah, right. And so basically, Gaddafi, who actually has a pretty decent nuclear weapons program going, is like, okay, send me the papers, I'll sign. Right, so they send him the papers, and he signs, and he's like, okay, here's my nuclear program. Some boxes over there. Pick it up. Right, they pick it up. They're like, damn! You're really doing some shit here. Right, and then, it sort of all seems like it's gravy. I mean, imagine you're Gaddafi, you run this oil state, you have enough oil to, feed your population, Before then, you were sort of cut off from the world with all these kind of crazy 70s shenanigans you were doing. You still have your brigade of Amazons or whatever, you still can be Gaddafi, your wacky self. Guy's a personality, you can't say he's boring. And now you get to go shopping at Harrods, right? Or your son gets to go shopping at Harrods. And sure enough, here's this beautiful succession strategy. You have Saif, right? The same name, Saif al-Gaddafi. And he's gone to the London School of Economics or whatever. He's not obviously weird. He can speak with investors. And so the future looks bright for the Gaddafi family. But problems begin to arise. So, they reopen the embassy in Tripoli, beautiful embassy, and
works very
all these
well
great
for a while,
ceremonies. Right? All these great ceremonies are happening. Works very well for a while. Good for business. Very good for business. The Europeans, I think, are really there first. But you start to see some problems. You start to see some problems, and these problems emerge in these cables. And one of the things, what this your story about the human rights violation of the ISIS, dude, is that the U.S. had some, of course, there was, for whatever reason in God, what town in it? Derna in Libya was a big Islamic center. There was a lot of jihadis came out of there.
Yeah.
So the U.S. is like, oh, now we have good relations with Libya. So here's what we can do. We can take some of these people from Guantanamo who are Libyans and offload them on Gaddafi. And so they do this, and there's a bunch of people who are offloaded on Gaddafi. The problem is now that, this is getting later in the 2000s, and the U.S. sort of press has kind of made a little more noise about these shenanigans that went on right after 9/11, where they're like, we're not going to torture you, but our Jordanian friends, might whatever, man. So, you just talk, like, I know, Jordan, great country. They're just a little enthusiastic sometimes, can't blame them for being a little backward, right? So this has gotten some press, this clever approach of having other people do your torturing for you. So it turns out that it's actually very important once these detainees have been sent to Libya to check on their well-being. Because otherwise the United States would be at fault for sending these guys to get tortured. And so there are all these cables like, we hear that so-and-so has hurt his shoulder, in the prison, tell us, we need to know more about the incident that led to this, right? So, it's already like, the problem is that the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, before there was a U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, imagine you're someone in Libya, you're young, you're up and coming, you're talented. A good question to ask whenever you're sort of drawing the landscape of power is, what should a young, talented person do? So a young, talented person in Libya in 1996 is like, I need to make friends with the Gaddafi family. If I could be hanging out, drinking beer with Saif, al-Gaddafi every day, that would be the best, right? Because then I would be, that's how you become a big man, right? Like you're friends with the crown prince, right? It's very straightforward. How do I get that access? How do I get there, right?
Exactly.
Suddenly, by putting the network, right? And the center of the network is the royal court of Gaddafi. Suddenly, when you put a U.S. embassy in Tripoli, there's another royal court there. So just as an example of how this networking works, for people that have been on the sort of cutting end of U.S. foreign policy, here's how this is done. Every Thanksgiving, in every U.S. mission in the world, there is a Thanksgiving party. Here are the people who are invited to this party. Anyone who works at the mission, any prominent local expat Americans, and anyone from the country who's cool, right? So let's say, yeah, exactly, right? So let's say you are so cool, one year you get an invitation to this party, you're like, wow, I really made it. And then you're there, and you see your friend Abdul across the room, and you're like, Abdul, you're cool too! And he's like, Saif, I had no idea you were so cool, right? And that's how networks are formed. And that's just life in the big city. And so suddenly, there's this alternate nexus of power here. And people in Libya start to see that they can matter by becoming visible to the U.S. Embassy. And the one way to become visible to the U.S. Embassy, of course, is to speak out against the Gaddafi regime. Because once you've spoken out against the Gaddafi regime in the old Libya, your life is over. Your life is mud. If you even have a life at all. But then suddenly, if you speak out against the Gaddafi regime once there's a U.S. embassy there, you're a dissident. And taking care of these dissidents, who are the first fragile seeds of maybe a future civil society in Libya, is very important. And yes, it's true. It's true that many of these young, promising men are Muslims. They believe in Allah. Yes, they can be very devout at times. Of course, the global war on terrorism is not a war on Islam. We support moderate Muslims. Nobody's ever like, oh, we got to fight Nazism by supporting moderate Nazis.
The official narrative.
Yeah, I mean the narrative, right? So so in the narrative, essentially. First of all, the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli is there to support these dissidents. Secondly, some of these dissidents are more Muslim than others. Some of them like there's another sort of source of energy there, like, yes, you can be a moderate Muslim, you can be, you're Western educated, but I mean, Muhammad Atta was Western educated, so you're essentially get into this situation where the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli becomes the prime protector of Gaddafi's enemies in the country. Moreover, anyone starts to realize that they can have a career as an enemy of Gaddafi. And so it's sort of almost as if you put the whole country in the microwave. Basically, every water molecule in Libya starts to boil. And suddenly...
Pretty good description.
And Libya, of course, somewhat unnatural country made from a number of different kind of geographical and tribal structures. The Italians, came in and did their colonialism thing and unified it. But there are these tensions, these fractures, these tribes.
Arabs and Berbers and
Arabs and Berbers and different. I mean, it's real. It's three different provinces of the Ottoman Empire, right? Fezzan and Cyrenaica and Tripoli, right? And so the Egyptians are like, oh, we're going to give this old Roman name of Libya, right? But nobody called it Libya before the the Italians got there. I mean, the Italians, for all their vices, they have many vices. They still have many vices, actually. But there's an Italian quarter of Tripoli. I don't see an American quarter of Tripoli. I don't expect an American quarter of Tripoli. They had an air base there for a while. I think it's covered with like blown up 747s now. So you see just this this empire of destruction that's sort of going on everywhere. I'll tell you, another story from the Arab world, which is this happened about maybe 2013, 2014. So, the Syrian civil war was happening, and I was at this event in San Francisco, which was like a venture capital event run by this thing called the Teal Foundation. And it was basically
which event? I didn't listen. Sorry.
Run by something called the Teal Foundation, and it was the 20 under 20, 20 under 20 Teal Foundation final event. And so what they had was 40 kids from around the world, teenagers, 20-year-olds, whatever, and they all had to come up in front of this, room full of Silicon Valley heavy hitters, which I was also in for some reason, and they had to present their idea for some startup or something in 2 minutes. So these kids have applied from all around the world, and one of them is a kid from Syria, and this unfortunate kid from Syria happens to have a name which starts with Abu or something like that, not too uncommon in Syria. The result of that is he has to go first. And so this poor kid from around the world, goes first and talks about his education startup or whatever. And I'm just like, man, you're obviously basically the best that Syria has to offer, right? And Syria, of course, has a lot to offer. And I mean, as we know, Steve Jobs' father was Syrian, but this poor kid, right? And so I come up to him afterward in the mentoring session, and I don't even talk about his startup idea. I mean, how is he going to have a good startup idea? I mean, he's just like, I'm sure he's gone on to good things because he was obviously a very talented kid, right? But I'm like, I say something really, this is really I was more tactless at this time. I've gained some tact. And so I'm like, which side is your family on in the Syrian civil war? And, which is a very rude question. And, he's like, well, I don't really support a side. I just, don't really want to have a civil war in my country, which of course basically means he's on the government side. But, I said to him, actually, I was like, do you want to know why the U.S. started a civil war in your country? And I'll tell you why.
Really,
and of course,
okay.
I really said this one. It was very rude, right? Yeah, you really shouldn't talk this way. And of course, in the Arab world, the way the U.S. perceived, and you really can't fault Arabs for perceiving the U.S. this way, is this very, very powerful entity that plays a lot of 4-dimensional chess. And sometimes 5-dimensional chess, and sometimes even 17-dimensional chess. So it's basically like the U.S. will do something that no one can understand. And basically, when the U.S. does something that no one can understand in a kind of obvious sense, and this is an obvious, like, sensible way to think, there's always like, oh, this is a 6-dimensional pool shot that will just result in like boom, 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 and then we'll have an oil pipeline to Afghanistan or some fucking shit like that. And this is a normal human way to think, but it's a very Arab way to think.
Simply because the Americans are capable, but they have no trust.
Yes.
So they can't predict anything. Yeah, you're right.
And so they don't really understand how these systems work, and the truth is sort of worse than they believe. And the truth is that it's like, why did the U.S. start a civil war in Syria? First of all, we have the undoubted fact that the U.S. started a civil war in Syria because they rolled out Obama and he said Assad must go, right? Okay, that's a way to start a civil war, right? Again, you could do that in Germany, you could do that in France, right? You did it in Syria, and why? Okay, I described sort of the vision of the new Arab world that these people had. Okay, why did they do that? In one sense, it's because they had this vision. I wouldn't really call the vision the cause of what they did. I think there's a very simple reason why the U.S. started all these civil wars, which can be expressed in only 3 words, and the answer is because it could. I think that basically when you look at the bureaucrats who made these decisions, essentially look at someone in the State Department who is, his names will be totally unknown to the world. Look at whoever, basically someone within state pushed a change in the Syria policy. There were some people within that establishment who were like, no, let's get closer to Assad, let's converge with Assad, let's make him our friend, let's do like the same as the Gaddafi thing. Of course, again, he starts out as a revolutionary leader, so there's a lot of kind of old leftist forces wanting to do that. And then there are the young people who are like, no, we need to bring, democracy to the Middle East. But the crucial thing about the young people, like the Samantha Powers and Susan Rice's and, zillions of people whose names nobody will ever know, but these are the best people America has, just biologically. They're just immensely talented, capable, young, smart people who have no clue. And the problem with the way that American imperialism works in this context is that can be summarized by the fact that if you were one of the, we'll never know who the person who made these decisions was. It's someone whose name nobody knows. But if you were, but internally it could be known. And if you were one of the people that made this decision with these like catastrophic results, both for the country, but for America's internal interest, America's own interests, even if anyone cares about that shit anymore, which they don't, your career on balance is going to be better because you made an impact. You mattered, and it's not your fault that things went wrong. Obviously, you're not in control of Assad getting Russian aid, or you don't expect that, right? Nobody, there's a lot of power there, but there's no responsibility. And because there's no responsibility, there's sort of that effort is not tied to any purpose at all. People, when they think about the U.S. acting in foreign policy, are always looking for a purpose. There's no purpose. It's just a completely out of control machine. And the way that I described it, this is it. And the way that I describe this sometimes is if you go back and you look at earlier imperialism, you look at British imperialism, or even American 19th century imperialism.
They had a purpose.
War. It had a purpose. They would play the same game. They would basically be like, I see that, there's a very bloody conflict in your country. We need to come in to protect, stop your human rights abuses against the rebels. Oh, wow, we have this country. What do we do with it? But, the thing is that when they had this country, they actually knew what to do with it. They're like, okay, we're going to develop the country. We're going to bring in commerce. We're going to have imperialism. We're going to have somebody making 10% off the rebar contract. We're going to do all these things that may not be completely pretty, but are actually going to develop this country and make it work. And you look at the British in Egypt. You look at, Egypt was very profitable for the British. And, Egypt also has a lot of things that the British. It had an army that the British built. They're pretty thankful for that army right now, I think. And so that was like, when you look at 19th century European imperialism, is it predatory? Is it rapacious? It is, but it's like a wolf hunting deer. It's like, at least when the wolf catches the deer, it's something that happens in nature. There's wolves, there's deer, the wolf eats the deer, but the wolf is eating the deer, and you look at and in the 20th century, it's more like you have a dog that's killing sheep. It's like the dog doesn't even know why it's fun to kill sheep. It's just like, wow, this is amazing. The taste of blood, the chase, and then it goes home for its dog food, right? And it doesn't even eat the fucking thing. And you kill like 20 of them, right? And is that, that's basically what's going on here. It's a tragedy, and it's a travesty as well.
Let me nail down your story with another story, which is actually from reality. My uncle's friend, he's a high officer in the Iraqi army, and he once told a story. He said in the 2005, when the Iraqi police, the Iraqi army, captured some militia from Al Qaeda, they say that after midnight, two American Hummers will come at night, and they release them for no fucking purpose. And they say, okay, on which fucking side are you? Are you on our side? Are you fighting ISIS, fighting Al Qaeda, or are you?
Truth is that they're not even on their own side, and the reason and the fact that they're not even on their own side is basically why they can't win. And I'll tell you exactly why they went and released those people. It's because the U.S. military right now employs a large number of lawyers, and it's called JAGs. And basically, the purpose of a judge advocate general is the purpose of that is to make sure there are no scandals. And basically, the thing that no one in this army wants to hear about is they wake up and they read in the Washington Post that of one of these, you saw these scandals, right? These scandals are real, and so basically, to avoid that happening, what happens is that you basically start to treat even war as if it was something like domestic policing, where it's basically like, okay, this is a suspect, you have rights, you can't sit on his head, and that turns out to be, you have all these people who come up with these theories. This is sort of a classic example of the way the U.S. is governed, in a sense, because that situation of like, oh, wow, if you do, even though this is a war, if you're like found doing cruel things to your enemies in the war, and there's a film of it, it's going to be on CNN tomorrow night. And everyone on your chain of command is going to get fucked and their career is going to end. So, how do we prevent this from happening? Why do we prevent this from happening? And the result is it creates this demand for these theories of war, which are basically say that, the best way to fight is not to fight. There's sort of these counterintuitive theories of war. This was already happening back in Vietnam, where sort of the ideology of the U.S. was like, no, actually, we want the guerrillas to be on our side. We want to be more like the enemy. We want to be a liberation movement too. We're actually competing to be a liberation movement with the guerrillas. So there's this famous book, by this military supposed expert on military science called John Nagel, and it has the wonderful title of How to Eat Soup with a Knife. And so you basically get this whole sort of school of like, no, you have to do the sort of hard thing. Don't do it in the obvious way just by like, being this like brutal person. You have to win their hearts and minds. You have to actually build like these sort of political structures. And you have to basically, the way you win a war is with love, and so winning a war with love is like eating a soup with a knife. You wouldn't think that you could normally do that. And strangely enough, you got the bowl of soup, you got the bowl in the knife, and you've been eating soup with a knife for a number of years now, and the bowl still appears to be full. So maybe this idea of like eating soup with maybe you should try just as an experiment. You might want to try spoon. and that's basically that's the reaction of everyone. I mean, sort of sane, to this sort of way of doing things. I'll tell you another story that's similar, to your story that I heard. I forget where I must have read this. It's not from personal experience, but I read this somewhere, and it sounds true at least, which is that a U.S. Foreign Service officer, a U.S. diplomat somewhere, is in the Gulf state, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, whatever. And he's talking to one of these sheikhs, right? And one of the things the sheikhs do is, of course, they love falcons. Come on, anyone would love a falcon if they could be a falconer, right? And one of the things they used to do, except it's too dangerous now, is fly their planes to Herat or something and go and hunt the Hubara bustard in Afghanistan for falcons. So they even know the place. And so this guy, this sheikh says to the diplomat, he's like, I have an idea. I think I know how you can win the war in Afghanistan. And the American is like, oh, do tell. He's just being polite. Of course, he knows this ignorant barbarian isn't going to tell him anything useful. The ignorant barbarian, it's like, well, I keep falcons, and one of the things we do with our falcons is we put a little chip on all of them. So I can tell you where all of my falcons are on the Arabian Peninsula, at any time. That's pretty cool, isn't it? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, so I had this idea. He's like, why don't we just put a chip on all the Afghans? We'll just give each of the Afghans a chip, just like one of the Falcons, and then you'll know where everyone is, and how could you lose a war with that information? And and there's some logistical challenges with this, but it's not the world's most reasonable idea in the modern world. Of course, the Foreign Service officer is just absolutely shocked at this idea, and he would be like, that's just like the biggest violation of human rights that I've ever heard of. And of course the ignorant barbarian is like, well, isn't like a 20 years of civil war like a human rights violation? But apparently it's not in the same category. That's how, like, when you're dealing with the US from the perspective of being out in this empire, it's like, it's so powerful, and it's just like, it's so stupid. And if there's just one thing I implore any listener in the Arab world to think of when you want to understand why the U.S. does something, like, think of the stupidest explanation first. Don't start with the smart stuff. The smart stuff is very unlikely to be right.
This is a good approach.
Actually, think of the stupidest thing that you can think of, and then, like, think of something that's even stupider than that, and you're probably right. Because the thing is, what's so confusing about dealing with these organizations, the State Department is a very elite organization. It's made up of, like, people who could probably work at Google. Maybe not quite that caliber, but, like, it's pretty elite. And so when you deal with people from this organization, they're pretty elite. And so when you're like, how could this be so stupid? I don't understand how this could be so stupid. You have to understand kind of the organizational dynamics and the organizational history, really. But if you don't want to understand that, just take it from me. It's stupid.
Which